Welcome back. Always nice to welcome the magpie and the lyrebird. Okay, so today's video is on corresponding squares, and I'm going to revisit Halberstadt. I don't think I gave him full credit last time for all the work he'd done, and I'm going to briefly mention Maizelis. He deserves his own video, so we'll do some of his studies later. Actually, I was going to do but then I found this really interesting problem. I've got the thumbnail up there, which Halberstadt came up with in 1954, and shortly after that, Maizelis came up with a slight variant. He moved the king across, and you sort of see this difference, just the difference one square makes. So I thought this is quite a fascinating study to look at. And so let me just go to the capture screen and just revisiting Halberstadt. There he is. And as I said, we mentioned last time that he actually had this very fancy artsy book, Opposition and Case Conjugates, with Duchamp, famous artist, which is kind of cool. And supposed to be like a work of art in its own right. You want to buy one, £8,000, £10,000, whatever. Be nice to see it. And then, but Halberstadt actually had his own book here, Curiosities, Tactics, Des Finales, is Endgame, right? And that's 1954, 1955, according to that. So this position, I think, comes from that book. I mean, obviously, I'm just relying on what you can find blog-wise in the internet, and it's quite interesting. And there's quite a long story in him. And then the variant which Maizelis came up with is he's famous in his own right for two things. First of all, where is it? He has it looks like the Russian version, but obviously Avabak's series on endgames and chess endings, pawn endings, was jointly written between Avabak and Maizelis, so very famous for that book. And then also this one, Soviet Chess Primer. You might have that one, but haven't read it. Must have a close look at it. So they're the two books he's really famous for, and there's a lot of studies. In fact, if you go down, you can look. Suddenly, they're all pawn end games. Well, a lot of pawn end games, right? So he only got 4 in there, but he's obviously done a lot more. And then I think when you look at this book here, the Avabak and Maizelis one, when you're looking at blogs, you'll see people referring to Puzzle So On in that book, or indeed Puzzle So On in Fine's Basic Chess Endings. They seem to be sort of the two endgame books, which have sort of given us some of the reference points. So let's have a look, get it out of the way. First of all, just a little history lesson. Maizelis, born in Ukraine. So if we run my little simulator thing here, let's still do the animated one. Let's just say it run through, and you can see the people pop up in sort of order of when they were born: Centurini, Datina, Otten, Neustadt, Locock, Lasker, Lake, Daedler, Bianchetti, Sackman, Reti, Ebers, Maizelis there, Grigoriev, Sharon, Oev, I think, Halberstadt, Cares. So you can see this is, I'm just trying to still give that sense of where a lot of the endgame and just basically chess theory was sort of coming from. And you can see early on we have a lot of these German, Austria, Czech style players, contribution from France and the UK. And then obviously the Keres, Halberstadt, Grigoriev, Avabak, and Maizelis are actually all a little bit later, and that's obviously when the Russian school takes over. I'll just close that, and then so let's just show the position. If you want to have a look at it and study it by yourself, it is very finely crafted. I always like the way you think, how do people come up with the ideas? First of all, this is an unusual position. Both players have a passed pawn, which means you have to stay inside the square. Black has to stay inside the square, doesn't have access to the B file, but equally true, white has to stay inside his square as well. For white has a lot of room to maneuver, but he can't start advancing to the black side of the board unless he's quite careful. And the other thing which you might notice is there are double pawns. Now, double pawns. It's not going to have any impact on it having two knights pawns. Not going to affect things. Well, hold my beer. Of course, the pawns are there also to sort of block the formation and make it an interesting sort of fairly fixed pawn structure. We'll see in one of the lines. It's very, very fascinating. And it reminds me of a couple of the like ones where actually it's the drawing or winning zone of the queen versus pawn endgame, which actually is the determining factor. Okay, so let me run the simulator first. That might give us a good look at it. Is that clear? To move it down a touch. Remember how this works. Basically, on every square of the board, I move the king around. King's moving around, and we want it to be a draw with white to move. It's showing you that this is actually it's a bit different, not quite looking at the table basis, but basically saying if you're on c3, the only move to draw is if the black king is d5. I think let's just look at some pretty quick things here. So we can't allow the pawn to be taken, right? So the only square you can be on if white is on e3 is on e5, and therefore that'll be certainly one of our pairs of corresponding squares. Basically, you could say that e4, d4, c4 are key squares. If white gets on one of those squares, he's going to pick up the black pawn and win the game. Okay, there's a technicality there. We'll see as we go through one of the lines, right? Because maybe black pushes his pawn, white pushes his pawn. Which is what's going to happen. But key squares, e4, so black must block on e5. So let's have a look as we go across. So on c3, black must be on d3. Now that's because of a strange oddity here, because if we go across to b3, you'd think that the drawing square would include b5, but it doesn't, because on b5, the white will just push his pawn, and that's where the difficulty comes from. That black can't go to b5, so he's got to hold b3 on c5, and therefore, when you're on c3, you now have to be on c4. The only way you can block access to, as I said, c4 and d4 being key squares. Now, but you might say, what happens if this is a situation? What happens if white goes to b4? Well, then what you actually do is you go to d4. You can see that's marked, and then basically now black's shepherded white's king away. Both people will promote their pawns. So you can see this sort of formation happens. And now let's work backwards. So let's say if you're on c3, you need to be on d5. So you go back to d2, you need to be on d6. Now obviously there's a few other squares there, but as we mark out the corresponding squares, we'll realize why that is the corresponding square. They're corresponding squares. And then if you're on e2, you have to be on d5. Once again, we'll only see this clearly when we get to corresponding squares. You could think d6 might satisfy you, but as you can see, you need to be on d6, so you can't be there. And you keep on mapping them across. If you're on f2, you need to be on d6. We'll see this as we go through it. And this is the key, right? You look at that square there, that there are two squares. It's very, very weird. On g2, black cannot be in his corner. He needs to be on d5 or c6. Very unusual. So that the point is that when we are on these squares here, doesn't really matter which ones, h1, h2, h3, because we're threatening to go to g2, which needs to be on c6 or d5. And actually, black can't get there in time. Partly because the d6 square is a corresponding square for other squares. So anyway, you move around. That gave me a good idea of how to think about the solution just by doing this simulation. And let me close that now. And we're going to go and map them out. If I can clear all this up. Now, because I've numbered it before, let's just go through some of those squares we were talking about. We saw that if you're on B3, you have to cover on C5. And if you're on C3, you have to cover on D5. Okay, and then we also had this square here where if white, confuses a bit, if white hops over to B4 trying to circle around, then we have to go to D4 and kind of setting in a pawn race and a draw. Okay, now because there's another square in here, I'm just going to call this square 5. I said black's got to move on to that D5 square to cover white's king 3. And you can see how it's forming, right? And why we had all these sort of corresponding squares, because a lot of squares already started to get used up. Okay, so now let's have a look at this square here. Actually, I think, first of all, remember those squares are not accessible. So just bear that in mind, right? So now we're going to have a square 4, which is giving you access between a square mark 2 and a square mark 5. And this is where the problems start to come in, because there is only one square, which gives access to both a square mark 2 and a square mark 5. So now we move to 6. So now we need to be able to go to 4 and 5. Once again, because of all the sort of crossed out squares, then E2 corresponds to D5. Okay, we're making very steady progress here. And then we have another square here, which will mark as 7, which gives access to 5 and 6. There's only one square which allows that. Note, you cannot go to D4. You'd think D4, but if you go to D4 this time, the pawn just runs. Okay, so now let's go to square down here. So we are threatening to go to 4 and to 6 and to 7. So square mark 8 can go to 4 and 6 and 7. And just bear in mind, you're next to two squares. One we go to 4 and 6, and another square goes to 6 and 7. So that rules out square E5 as an 8 because there's just no flexibility. You don't have that second move. But what we'll see is that it will mark C6 as corresponding square 8. So we can go to 4 and 7 and 6. It's a little bit bad because obviously the 4 and the 7 are on the same square. And then now we're talking squares marked 9, which is a little bit double counting here, but 9 will go to 4 and a 6, and this 9 will go to 6 and a 7. So this square C5 becomes the square marked 9. It's also, if you have a look, it's not really 8, but we'll call this square 8, right? So this sort of gives you the, I should have called something else, but I call it 8, right? So 8 needs to be one square away from 1. So here, 3 squares away, move to 9, and shoot backwards and forwards, right? So what you got now is you've got the full layout of the squares. And, so that's the corresponding square. So actually, black can survive. If he gets on the right loop, then he'll oscillate between 8 and 9, and then when white decides to go 4, 6, or 7, black will be able to do the same. However, there's one problem with this, and this always gets back to the mean way people set up the initial positions. And we're going to call this A, right? So those squares allow black to get to a 7 or a 9. And what you'll see is that I guess the clearest A would be there. We go back to the thumbnail, 1 second. You'll notice that on D7 square, which was Halberstadt's version, can't get to C6 in one move, whereas Maizelis' one on D7 you can, and it's a draw, right? So that's kind of what we're heading for, and we'll understand a little bit better. So that's why, and in fact, it's also why that it doesn't matter if white's on H3 or H2 or H1, just he's moving on to squares mark A, threatening goes squares mark 7 and 9, which to be able to do that, black would have to get to C6. So that's the corresponding squares of this position. There's a lot behind this, so let's now go to some of the lines. This is the one. Okay, right. So this is a win for white. Let's go through one of the lines. King G2, King H2. Black gets off the hook because he just goes D7. It's the first thing to notice. Look at that line. So we'll cover this. Is basically covering the Maizelis. If you go to D7, D6. So actually, I've done D7, D6, which is fine, right? So now let's assume white starts running across. He thought he was being clever, so we've moved on to A. That also qualifies. You just need to be able to go to a 7 or a 9 next move. Go to a 7, go to a 7. Go to an 8, we go to 8. Go to a 9, we go to a 9. Go to a 4, go to a 4. Go to an 8, go to an 8. And then, what are you going to do? If you go to B3, we'll just go to C5. And if we keep on fussing around here, well, we're just going to keep on fussing around here. It's all only move stuff. We go up here, we go up there, we go back to there, we hop on to the 6. We can't reconstruct it. We just go back, then we go back there. And this is a draw. I mean, probably what if you don't believe me, I got the engine running here in the background. Just there's always a move. We can always hop onto the squares, right? So that is, if we go back to the initial position, if white stuffs around. So let's do the main line now. So we have gone to square mark A. Now the point is, you can see that we can actually get to A via the D6 square. Now that's losing. Well, they're all losing. The point in this case is that rather than going D7 and then across to the square mark 8 or 9, this is a square you'd like to go to, but unfortunately it's a square mark 7, so we go to the square mark 7. It doesn't really matter what we do, just to continue a line here, King D5 maybe, so we go to square mark 6, and then we go there, force back, so you lose the pawn. That doesn't help, right? Let's choose a longer defense, but we just move on to the 4, longest defensive line, King D5, but now we run on the 2, okay? King E5, take this sort of diagonal opposition. King C4. If he backs off, he's just going to lose his pawn. So the line given is push the pawn. We come back for the pawn. Take some sort of opposition. Take the pawn. Black could have pushed the pawn one square. Some sort of opposition. So you can see we're going to be able to win this. Let's go through a winning line, which I haven't coded up. 2. Can't come forwards. We're going to do a nice little triangulation here, I think. King d2. We can't go back to e6, so let's go king c5, for instance. c3. Now we've got the opposition. King d5, 3, 5. Work around the outside. King c4. Falls back. King d4. Falls back. King e5. Okay, right. So you can see how that line wins. So if we go all the way back to where this line came from. So all these lines were based on if black went on to, and with that we have the merry dance, and we can win. Okay, so a better defensive try is actually last longer. King d7. Don't go onto the mine square. Still doesn't really help us very much, because what can we move on to which black cannot move on to? This is the point. We now move on to our square mark 9. And we go on to, if black goes on to square mark 7, we'll have exactly the same variation we just saw. So it's a little bit better to go on to c6, but then now we'll obviously move across to e1, square mark 8. Now black has to make a choice. Let's say he chooses king c5. So we'll go on to our square marked 9 now, sort of threatening as many squares as possible. Back to square marked 8. Now we go to this square marked 8. Black tries to hold us off. We use this merry dance, so basically penetrating around the queen side. Square marked 4, 7. We don't have one of those, so king b4, king c4 both win. King b4 is best. Diagonal opposition. Black is trying to block us off. If he was on d4, now he would have blocked us off, but he's not. King c3, we go on to square mark 2. What's he going to do now? Let's say he goes to c5. Then I have to get back to what I mentioned. There's a win here because you got doubled pawns, and this is where you got to break through by pushing your pawn. Don't think do this much differently. We're on the key squares for the black pawn, which means you get to take it. Okay, but he's got the opposition. Guess what? Actually, I haven't coded this up, but just quickly go through it. Be there. Just king back. Defense out king. And check. Can't go in front. Goes in front. We're going to mate him. Is that the double pawn gave us the extra tempo. We could have sacrificed our pawn and got a winning position that way as well. Right, so you can see that the second pawn was important in the end. Okay, so if we've got that, just go back to starting position. So this one I really loved because two squares of the pawns, restricting king movement. Got double pawn, which becomes critical in the solution. And it just, the starting position of the king is very sensitive, right? If the black king could get to the key square, c6 is pretty much his key square. And if he's on c6, he can hold most things. But because of the unfortunate position of the black king, and also the fact that the d6 square is mined g2 because it is corresponding square for f2, unfortunately. Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. I found that a really interesting one, and thank you very much for watching.